The fence had never failed. Not once in the 26 years since the Forest Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary opened its gates to visitors and school children, tucked away in the misty pines of northern Montana. But that morning, cold, gray, and humming with the tension of an incoming storm, something changed. A latch slipped, a gate swung open, and Magnus, the sanctuary's only lion, an aging, once proud creature with eyes that had seen too much, stepped out into the world he hadn't touched since he was a cub in the Sahara. No one saw him leave, not the sleepy groundskeeper doing his morning rounds, not the college intern sipping coffee in the viewing hut, and definitely not the massive, territorial grizzly named Thorn, who had just been transferred into the adjacent open zone the night before. What happened when they met, on a muddy path lined with pine needles and silence, would become the most controversial moment in the sanctuary's history, and no one was prepared for what came next. Magnus didn't run. Even with the wind stirring his mane like it remembered something lost, even with freedom laid out before him like a forgotten dream, he walked, slow, deliberate, almost reluctant. His paws sank into the damp earth, each step a quiet defiance of a life spent behind bars. He paused at the tree line, his breath visible in the cold morning air, and lifted his head, not to roar, but to listen. He had heard it, a grunt, deep, close, and then the crack of a branch. Thorn emerged from the fog like a myth, towering, scarred, eyes wide with the kind of fury that came not from instinct, but memory. He had been torn from the Alaskan wild, sedated, caged, transferred. Now he was awake in a land that smelled wrong, felt wrong, and sounded like steel instead of snow. He wasn't going to share it. The bear charged. Magnus didn't move. At first, for a moment it looked like he had given up, that the years of confinement had stolen his fire, his reflex, his will to fight. But then, just as Thorn's massive form lunged forward, Magnus stepped sideways, fast and low, ducking the initial blow with the grace of a predator who hadn't forgotten what he was. The earth trembled beneath their weight. The clash wasn't like anything the sanctuary had ever witnessed. Not between animals of this size, not unsupervised, not this personal. Claws met muscle. Roars echoed into the treetops. Magnus struck first, shoulder to ribs, trying to unbalance the bear. But Thorn was stronger, fresher, and furious. He reared back, slamming both paws down onto the lion's back. The sound Magnus made then, it wasn't a roar. It was something else, something ancient. A cry that made the sanctuary staff, now sprinting toward the chaos, freeze in their tracks. The fight should have ended there, but it didn't. Because as Thorn moved in for the final blow, Magnus did something no one could explain. He turned his back, exposed his throat. He surrendered. And what the bear did next was not what anyone expected. But Thorn didn't strike. His giant paw hovered in the air for a second, then another, until it trembled, not from rage, but hesitation. Something in Magnus's posture, head bowed, eyes open, no growl, no retreat, triggered a pause that no one watching could explain. The bear growled low, a confused guttural sound. His breath steamed between his teeth. He had fought moose, wolves, even other bears in his past, but never like this. Never with an opponent who stared not with fear, but something eerily close to acceptance. Magnus didn't flinch. He simply stood still, not frozen, but intentional, as if saying, "Go ahead, I've survived worse." The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then Thorn, inch by inch, lowered his paw. Not onto Magnus's body, but the earth beside him. And then, unbelievably, he stepped back. The handlers watching through binoculars couldn't believe what they were seeing. Two apex predators, wild instincts still sharp, standing mere feet apart without moving to finish what had started. It defied every rule of behavior they had known. But Magnus and Thorn weren't following rules anymore. They were survivors. And in that moment, they saw themselves in one another. Not enemies, but echoes. Magnus slowly turned his head, their eyes locked, and for a brief second, they breathed as one. Not friends, not foes, just free. But freedom, as both creatures would learn, came with consequences. The moment shattered when the distant sound of a tranquilizer gun cracked through the forest. Magnus flinched, not for himself but for the bear. Thorn reared up, roaring, the spell between them broken. Rangers flooded the clearing, shouting commands, aiming darts, radios buzzing like angry wasps. Magnus didn't run. Instead, he turned toward the chaos and did something no one expected. He placed himself between the Rangers and the bear. Yes, the lion, protecting the beast that had nearly ended him moments before. The Rangers paused, confused, and then Thorn, massive and lumbering, stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the thick green underbrush, as if he understood this wasn't his fight anymore. One dart struck Magnus, then another, his legs buckled, muscles trembling, vision blurring. But even as he collapsed, he turned his head, searching for the last place Thorn had stood, not with fear, with purpose, as if saying, "You go, I'll take this one." Magnus hit the ground with a soft thud, and in that moment the forest fell silent once more. He had survived a cage. He had survived a bear. But now the question remained. Would the world let him survive his own compassion? The truck arrived within minutes, a reinforced transport meant for dangerous animals. But what they found wasn't a beast thrashing in rage. It was a lion, still conscious, eyes heavy with sedative, lying quietly as if exhausted not by the chase, but by the choices he'd made. The handlers approached cautiously, unsure if this was the same animal who had once brought tourists to tears with his gentle gaze. His fur was caked with dirt. A scratch from the bear's swipe bled slowly down his shoulder. But Magnus didn't move, not when they wrapped the harness around him, not when they whispered, "Easy now, boy." What no one could explain, what the zoo staff later whispered about behind closed doors, was how Thorn the bear was never found again. Not a paw print, not a broken branch. As if he had vanished into the forest, carrying with him the unspoken memory of a lion who had spared him. Back at the sanctuary, Magnus didn't roar for days. He didn't eat at first. He just stared at the treetops beyond the enclosure fence, where he'd once glimpsed a freedom he hadn't known he needed, and where he'd left something behind. Not fear, not anger, but trust. And in the quiet corners of the sanctuary, the staff began to notice something strange. Birds nesting near his sleeping quarters, a fox visiting just outside the fence at dusk, and one night, caught on a low-res camera, two glowing eyes watching from the shadows beyond the trees. Huge, unblinking, familiar. Magnus blinked back, and in that moment, they both remembered. What had begun as instinct, fight or flee, had become something else entirely, a recognition, a silent pact between two creatures who had only ever been taught to dominate or die. But in that rare twilight moment, they had chosen neither. The sanctuary staff thought it was coincidence, just a bear wandering too close, just a lion pausing too long at the fence. But as days turned into weeks and the same glowing eyes reappeared, never threatening, never encroaching, some began to wonder, was this the same bear? The one from the forest clearing? The one whose life Magnus had spared? Then came the morning when Magnus stood at the edge of his enclosure, unmoving, watching something beyond the tree line. The sun barely risen, a hush blanketing the world. And there, barely visible between the trunks, a massive shadow, watching back. Neither roared, neither turned away. It was as if some ancient bond, born not of species but of survival, held them in place. A bond forged in fear, tested in mercy, and sealed in silence. The keepers started documenting the encounters. Every few days, the bear, now named Bramble by the staff, would appear just beyond the outer fence. Never aggressive, never erratic, just present. Magnus would always know. Before any human saw Bramble coming, Magnus would be at the edge of his habitat, waiting, as if summoned by something unspoken. Once a new zookeeper tried to chase the bear off with noise and light. Bramble didn't flinch. He didn't growl. He simply looked past the human, locking eyes with Magnus again, before turning away and melting back into the forest. Over time, the zoo redesigned parts of Magnus's enclosure. They extended the perimeter, added reinforced viewing areas, and installed motion-sensitive cameras to monitor Bramble's visits. But none of the footage could explain the stillness between them. The way Magnus would sit and blink slowly, the way Bramble would tilt his head, as if remembering something painful, yet important. It wasn't friendship, not in the way humans understood it. It was something older, something wild. And then one day, Bramble didn't come. Magnus waited at dawn, and again at dusk. The next day passed, and the next. He paced more, ate less, refused to engage with the enrichment toys he once loved. By the end of the week, keepers noticed something odd. Magnus had started placing straw in a pile in the same corner where he used to greet Bramble. Every morning, a new pile, as if building a shrine, or a nest, or something to mark absence. Until one foggy morning, Bramble returned, but this time he was limping, blood on his side, a gash across his shoulder, signs of a fight, or something worse. Magnus roared for the first time in months, not in anger, in warning, in mourning, in recognition. Magnus roared again, longer this time, deeper. It echoed through the compound, waking birds and rattling windows. The keepers rushed to the outer fence, hearts pounding, unsure whether it was a call of aggression or distress. But what they saw stunned them. Magnus wasn't pacing or charging. He was standing completely still, eyes locked on Bramble, who now sat just beyond the tree line, wounded, breathing heavily, but calm. The lion took a step back, and then he did something no one expected. He lay down. Right there, at the edge of the fence, lowering his massive body slowly to the earth, his mane catching the morning light like gold through mist. On the other side, Bramble mirrored him. Both creatures, predator and rival by nature, now resting inches apart, only a metal barrier between them. For over an hour, they didn't move. Keepers didn't dare interfere. Cameras rolled, phones buzzed with alerts. The zoo director himself came out, speechless. Later that evening, the vet team found Bramble collapsed just beyond the woods. Whatever had injured him had taken its toll. They sedated him carefully and brought him to a small rehabilitation pen near the medical wing. Magnus refused to eat. He didn't roar again, didn't touch his food, didn't interact with staff. Not until Bramble was carried past on a gurney, unconscious but alive. The lion stood, not fast, not sudden, but with intent. He followed the stretcher's path from within his enclosure, pacing gently alongside the keepers, his eyes never leaving the limp body of the bear. And when Bramble was placed in his temporary healing enclosure, just across from Magnus's own, something extraordinary happened. Magnus laid back down and didn't move for hours. It was as if some unspoken promise had been fulfilled, a vigil kept. Over the next few days, the zoo witnessed something no wildlife documentary had ever captured. Two apex predators bonded not by blood or instinct, but by trauma and something more. Every time the veterinary staff approached Bramble to administer treatment, Magnus would rise, not in threat, but in attention. His eyes would track every movement, his ears twitching at every sound Bramble made. And Bramble, though sedated, seemed to breathe easier whenever Magnus was nearby. The zoo installed cameras, first for safety, then for science. But soon the footage spread across the internet. People watched in awe as the lion, day after day, sat silently in front of the glass that separated him from the recovering bear. They watched him press his paw gently against the glass, mirroring Bramble's groggy occasional movement. They saw something no one could explain: empathy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and bathed the enclosures in amber light, something remarkable happened. Bramble stood, slowly, unsteadily, but he stood. Magnus rose too and let out a soft, low rumble, not quite a roar, more like a hum. Bramble turned his head, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, and Bramble nodded. The zookeepers who witnessed it swore they felt the air shift, because in that moment, two creatures, one who had been caged and attacked, the other wild and broken, had found something beyond survival, a quiet understanding, a shared grief, a bridge where instinct had once ruled. And for the first time in his life, Magnus purred. The staff couldn't believe what they were seeing. Magnus, the same lion who once barely reacted to enrichment toys, who seemed disconnected from everything but the faraway horizon, was now alert, emotionally invested, present. And Bramble, the bear who had nearly died from his wounds, was recovering faster than any of the vets had expected. They started scheduling their outside time so the two animals could see each other more. Though separated by reinforced fencing, the bond between them seemed to grow stronger each day. Bramble would pace along the edge of his enclosure until Magnus appeared in the adjacent habitat. And when they finally locked eyes, everything else, noises, people, cages, faded into the background. Visitors returned, but not to see the lion or the bear. They came for them, the miracle duo who weren't supposed to coexist, let alone connect. One afternoon, a child asked the zookeeper, "Are they friends?" The keeper paused, then smiled. "They're survivors," she said, "and sometimes that's stronger than friendship." That evening, as a gentle rain fell over the zoo and twilight cast long shadows through the trees, Magnus lay down facing Bramble's enclosure, his golden mane damp, his body relaxed. Bramble lumbered close and leaned his bulk gently against the shared barrier. And for a few quiet seconds, the two simply breathed, together. But even that fleeting moment of calm couldn't erase the reality that lingered. Behind closed doors, debates erupted among the zoo board. Their wounds began to heal, physically and emotionally. Bramble, once restless and aggressive, no longer paced his pen or growled through the bars. And Magnus, who had spent years in dignified silence, began to vocalize soft, contented rumbles. Researchers scrambled to document it. Ethologists called it unprecedented. But the zookeepers, those who had known both creatures intimately, simply said, they found what no one could give them, each other. And while the world debated ethics and science, questioned rehabilitation programs, and cross-species cohabitation, the lion and the bear didn't care. They had survived chaos. They had survived captivity. Now they had each other, and in that quiet companionship, the wildest part of their nature, the need to fight, to dominate, to destroy, finally lay to rest. As the days turned into weeks, their bond only deepened. Visitors who once gasped at the sight of a lion and bear in the same enclosure now stood in stunned silence, watching moments that felt almost sacred. Children pointed with wide eyes as Magnus gently nudged Bramble awake from his afternoon nap. Elderly couples whispered, hand in hand, as they witnessed the lion sharing a bone with the bear, something no one could have imagined in their wildest dreams. But it wasn't just peaceful coexistence. It was something more profound. When Bramble's old leg injury flared up, Magnus stood beside him, guarding him from curious onlookers and even from zoo staff. And when Magnus suffered a minor illness, Bramble wouldn't eat until the lion stirred from his rest. Some said it was instinct, others called it coincidence. But those who saw it in person knew this was something else, something sacred, something that defied explanation. It was as if, in each other, they had found not just safety, but healing, not just comfort, but redemption. Magnus had lost his pride. Bramble had never known family. And yet, together, they had become a unit stronger than any biological bond. Two survivors, two broken hearts, two second chances, intertwined. And in the soft rustle of the trees around their shared enclosure, in the silence between the distant calls of other animals, there was a stillness, a sense of awe that settled over everyone who witnessed it. Because sometimes the wild doesn't just wound, sometimes it restores. And this was one of those rare, miraculous times. It wasn't long before zookeepers noticed something even more astonishing. When a violent summer storm rolled through Ontario, knocking down trees and rattling the enclosures, the staff rushed to secure the animals. Winds howled through the steel bars and animals cowered in fear. But in the midst of the chaos, Magnus and Bramble did something no one anticipated. The lion stood tall, planting himself firmly between the storm and the shivering bear. And Bramble, despite his limp, leaned against Magnus, not out of fear, but as if to lend him strength. Security footage later revealed what words couldn't capture. A lion, sheltering a bear with his own body, refusing to move even as debris fell just feet away. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't training. It was choice. It was trust. And from that day forward, their story became more than a zoo legend. It became a symbol, a lesson whispered between visitors, a quiet revolution in the way people thought about animals and about themselves. Teachers brought students to watch, not for entertainment, but for empathy. Veterans visited and wept, saying they saw their own pain and healing mirrored in Magnus's eyes. Families came, broken by grief or loss, and left with something like hope, given not by words but by the sight of two creatures who should have been enemies, choosing instead to become brothers, because Magnus and Bramble had shown the world something rare, that even in a cage, even after violence, even after abandonment and fear and heartbreak, you can still choose love. And as the seasons passed, their bond only deepened. Magnus and Bramble developed a routine, one that baffled experts and moved spectators to tears. Every morning as the keepers brought food, Bramble would wait patiently for Magnus to eat first, nudging his share toward him with a gentle paw. In return, Magnus began grooming Bramble's thick fur, careful not to disturb the scars or the healing patches on his back. They napped side by side, often in mirrored poses, as if their bodies had learned to breathe in sync. When Magnus had a restless night, pacing under the moonlight, Bramble would follow behind like a silent shadow, offering presence instead of pressure. And perhaps the most astonishing moment of all came on a day that seemed ordinary at first. A child had been crying near the enclosure, lost, panicked, separated from their parents during a busy weekend. The commotion echoed through the zoo. The keepers ran to assist. But what stunned everyone was that Magnus roared, not aggressively, not with fear, but a long, low, steady bellow, one he hadn't let out in years. It drew everyone's attention instantly, and just behind him, Bramble stood upright on his back legs, watching the child. Only when the staff turned and located the boy, crouched near a bush, did they realize what had happened. The animals had noticed what the humans had missed. It wasn't just intelligence, it wasn't just instinct, it was awareness, it was empathy. And as the child was reunited with his parents, tears streaming down their faces, one of the zookeepers whispered, "They're watching over us, just as we claimed to watch over them." From that day forward, the zoo was never the same. Visitors no longer came just to see the animals. They came to witness the miracle of connection between a lion and a bear, between nature and nurture, between survival and something far deeper. Parents would point to Magnus and Bramble, telling their children, "See them? They weren't supposed to be friends, but they chose kindness." School children drew pictures of the pair. News crews came and went, but the two animals remained unfazed, existing not for the cameras, but for each other. The zoo staff too changed. They began rethinking enclosures, exploring enrichment not just for entertainment, but for healing. Some even started calling that corner of the zoo the sanctuary, because it felt like more than just a place. It felt like a lesson, a reminder that sometimes, even in the aftermath of violence, trust can be rebuilt, that even creatures born to be enemies can rewrite the rules of nature. And as the days turned to months, then to years, Magnus and Bramble grew older, together, their faces weathered with time, their bodies slower, but their bond untouched. They would sit side by side as the sun dipped below the treetops, leaning into each other in silence. And every once in a while, as if remembering something no one else could understand, Magnus would let out a soft, rumbling growl, not of warning but of contentment, and Bramble would nuzzle closer, because they had chosen each other, not just once, but every single day since the moment the cage broke open. Years later, keepers would recall that day not as the day a lion escaped, but the day something ancient was undone. Magnus, the once caged predator, had every reason to lash out, to claim dominance, to fall into the instincts wired into his very blood. But instead, he hesitated. He saw fear in the eyes of another creature, and he chose compassion. Bramble, the bear who should have fought, should have defended his space, instead welcomed the wounded king with an understanding born from pain of his own. The zoo had brought them there for safety, for survival. But somehow they had found something far rarer: a family. Visitors still came in droves, but not for spectacle. They came for the story, to stand at the edge of the enclosure and witness the impossible. A lion and a bear resting together, a silent testimony to resilience, healing, and choice. Because in a world where cages are all too common, literal and metaphorical, Magnus and Bramble reminded us that freedom doesn't always mean escape. Sometimes it means forgiveness. If this story moved you, share it. Because sometimes the fiercest hearts don't roar. They remember, they stay.